Right now, one of the biggest films of the year is pulling millions of people back to a story that is nearly 3,000 years old. Christopher Nolan, the director behind some of the most ambitious movies ever made, has turned his cameras on Homer's Odyssey. And suddenly, a tale most people last thought about in a school classroom is everywhere again. Odysseus, the Cyclops, the Sirens, the 10-year journey home. You know the story, even if you've never read a single line of it. A king sails home from a war. It should take him days. It takes him 10 years. Along the way, he meets a one-eyed giant, a witch who turns his men into pigs, sirens whose song lures sailors to their deaths, and a sea monster with 6 heads. Gods argue over his fate in the sky above him. It is the greatest adventure story ever told, and for almost 3,000 years, we have filed it under one single word: myth. But what if that word is hiding something? What if, underneath the monsters and the gods, the Odyssey is describing a real journey, a real war, and a real world, and we've spent centuries looking at the map completely wrong? Let's separate two questions, because people constantly blur them together. The first question is, were the monsters real? The second is, was the world around the monsters real? Those are not the same question, and the answer to the second one is far stranger and far better supported than you'd expect. Start with the war itself. The Odyssey is a sequel. Before Odysseus ever set sail for home, there was the Trojan War. 10 years of Greeks besieging the great city of Troy. For most of recorded history, educated people assumed Troy was pure invention. A fairy tale city, no more real than the giant at the top of a beanstalk. Serious scholars would have laughed at the idea of going to look for it. One man refused to laugh. In the 1870s, a wealthy and stubborn German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann became convinced the poem was not fiction but a set of directions. He believed the descriptions in Homer pointed to a real place, and he went looking for it in northwestern Turkey, at a mound called Hizarlik. The academic establishment considered him a deluded amateur, chasing a children's story with a shovel. What he dug up rewrote the argument. Buried under that mound was not one city, but 9. Built on top of each other across thousands of years, like a vast and lopsided layer cake of human history. One of those layers, the city archaeologists now call Troy 6, was a wealthy, fortified settlement that traded with the Greek world, and it fell in roughly the right period. Some layers show arrowheads, scorch marks, signs of fire, and unburied bodies, the archaeological fingerprints of a city that did not simply fade away, but died violently. And it doesn't stop with the dirt. Records from the Hittite Empire, an entirely separate civilization writing on clay tablets far to the east, mention a city they called Wilusa, a name many linguists connect directly to Ilios, the other ancient Greek name for Troy. The Hittite documents even record political tension and conflict involving that city. Two completely independent sources, Greek poetry and Hittite bureaucracy, appear to be pointing at the same fortified town on the same coast. So the setting of the story turns out to be real. There was a Troy. It was rich, it was fortified, and at least one version of it burned. The stage the Odyssey is performed on is not invented, but a real stage doesn't make the play real. So let's follow Odysseus out to sea, and here's where almost everyone, including the movie posters and the illustrated maps in the back of your school textbook, gets it wrong. Open any popular map of Odysseus's journey. You'll see a wild path sprawling across the entire Mediterranean. He's blown from Turkey all the way west, sometimes as far as Spain, looping around Italy, down to the coast of North Africa, even out toward the open Atlantic. It looks enormous. It looks impossible. And that impossibility is the first clue that something is off. Because think about the basic geography. The actual sailing distance from Troy to Ithaca, Odysseus's home island, is not vast. Under decent conditions, a Bronze Age ship could cover it in a week or two. 10 years is not a sailing time. 10 years is a story about a man who cannot get home no matter what he does, no matter how hard he tries, no matter how close he gets. So how did we end up with a map that flings him across the entire sea? The answer is that later writers, living centuries after the poem was composed, tried to pin each fantastical stop onto a real, faraway location, and the farther and stranger the location, the better. It made the adventure grander, more worldly, more impressive. But more recent scholarship suggests the exact opposite of grandeur. It suggests that the real geography of the Odyssey may be surprisingly small, hugging the coasts and islands close to Greece itself. The Ionian Sea, the waters around the Peloponnese, not a Mediterranean-spanning epic at all, but something far more local, later inflated into legend by storytellers who wanted the map to feel as big as the myth. And if you assume this is some modern revisionist debate, here is the part that should genuinely stop you. It isn't modern at all. Over 2,000 years ago, the Greek geographer Eratosthenes, the same brilliant mind who measured the size of the entire Earth using nothing but a stick, a well, and a shadow, was already deeply skeptical that Odysseus's wanderings could ever be placed on a real map. And he said so with perfect cutting ancient sarcasm. He declared that you would find the exact route of Odysseus's wanderings on the day you found the cobbler who stitched together the bag of winds. In other words, it's a story. Stop hunting for the precise spots on a chart. Think about that. The ancient Greeks were already arguing about whether their own national myth was geographically real, and one of the smartest people who ever lived was standing up and saying, calmly, do not take this map literally. So the popular image you carry in your head of a hero flung helplessly across the whole known world may be almost entirely a later fiction, layered on top of a much smaller, much more real journey. Now, what about the monsters themselves? This is where the story becomes genuinely ingenious, because many of the Odyssey's most famous horrors sit directly on top of real, deadly places, described in the coded language of sailors. Take Scylla and Charybdis, the six-headed monster and the ship-swallowing whirlpool placed on opposite sides of a narrow strait so that steering away from one drives you straight into the other. For a very long time, scholars have connected that deadly pair to the Strait of Messina, the treacherous channel between Sicily and mainland Italy, infamous for its violent, unpredictable currents and whirlpools. To a Bronze Age sailor with no charts, no compass, and no engine, a strait that could seize your ship and spin it apart was, in every practical sense, a living monster. Naming it Charybdis was not fantasy. It was a survival warning, wrapped inside a story so terrifying that you would never forget it. Keep going, and the pattern holds. The land of the Cyclops, the one-eyed giants, has been linked by some scholars to Sicily or possibly Crete, exactly the places the Greeks were beginning to explore and colonize around the time the poem was taking shape. The lotus eaters, whose flower makes Odysseus's men forget their longing for home, read remarkably like a description of a real stretch of the Libyan coast, complete with a plant that dulls the mind and softens the will. Even the sirens, whose song lures sailors onto the rocks, work perfectly as a memory for a real stretch of coastline so beautiful or so dangerous that ships kept wrecking there. And here's a detail that most people miss entirely. The specific mythological flavor of some of these places doesn't actually match generic mainland Greek mythology. It reads like myths that were picked up on location, absorbed from the real legends of real foreign coastlines, which is exactly what you would expect if the story grew out of genuine sailors' tales, carried home from genuine voyages, rather than being spun from one poet's imagination in a single room. Which leads us to the strangest and most beautiful possibility of all. What if the Odyssey isn't really the invention of a single genius named Homer, but something closer to a compressed, encoded database of the entire Bronze Age world of seafaring, real routes, real hazards, real foreign coasts, all bundled together into an unforgettable adventure precisely so that the knowledge would survive? Because here is how oral cultures actually stored their most critical information, long before writing was common. Not in manuals, not in charts, in stories. A dry instruction like dangerous whirlpool at the northern strait, keep to the southern shore, is forgotten within a single generation. But a six-headed monster that devours exactly 6 men, positioned directly across from a whirlpool that swallows entire ships, so that a captain is forced to choose which death he is willing to risk. That, you remember. That, you tell your son on his first voyage. That survives for 3,000 years and crosses into a Hollywood film. The monster is the memory device. The myth is the hard drive. And we know the poem was almost certainly not written by one man sitting down at a desk. It was shaped over centuries, passed mouth to mouth, voice to voice, by generation after generation of oral storytellers, each one adding, polishing, sharpening, before it was finally written down somewhere around the 7th or 8th century BCE. The Odyssey may be less like a novel and more like a coral reef built up slowly by countless hands, out of the accumulated real experience of an entire seafaring civilization. And there is one more layer sitting above the geography and the sailor's warnings that your school may actually have taught you first. The Greeks didn't just wrap real dangers in monsters, they wrapped them in a moral world. Odysseus's 10 lost years are not only bad weather and bad luck, they are, in the logic of the poem, the price of hubris. He blinds the Cyclops, a genuinely clever escape, and then, unable to resist, he shouts his own name across the water in triumph. That single act of arrogance hands his enemy a name to curse and calls down the wrath of Poseidon that keeps him from home for a decade. His men, warned again and again, slaughter the forbidden cattle of the sun god and pay with their lives. The arrogant suitors devouring his household are cut down in the poem's final act. To the ancient Greeks, this was the deepest layer of all. That pride against the gods, that hubris always carries a cost. So the map was real. The dangers were real. And stitched over both deliberately was a lesson about human arrogance that they wanted to survive just as badly as the sailing routes. The story carries all three at once, so run the reframe all the way to its end. When Christopher Nolan puts Odysseus on a giant IMAX screen, fighting the Cyclops in the firelight, you can watch it in two completely different ways. You can see a fantasy, gods, giants, and magic. Or you can see something stranger and truer underneath it, a real war at a real burned city. A real journey along real and dangerous coasts, real hazards remembered as monsters because that was the only technology an oral culture had for saving a sailor's life. And a map what we have been drawing wrong for 2,000 years, simply because we wanted the legend to be bigger than the truth. The monsters were never really the point. They were the packaging. You were taught that the Odyssey is a myth, a beautiful lie about gods and heroes. But peel back the packaging and you find something no ordinary myth should contain. A burned city that genuinely existed, confirmed by two separate civilizations, a strait that genuinely kills, a coastline of genuine dangers, and an ancient scientist already warning his own people. 2,000 years ago, not to take the map too literally. The Odyssey isn't a story pretending to be real. It is something far rarer than that. A real world, hidden so carefully inside a story, so brilliantly disguised as monsters and gods that we mistook the hiding place for the whole truth. And now, 3,000 years later, sitting in a dark theater watching it all over again, we are still unfolding the map.